As people move, as people remove natural gas appliances from their homes and replace them with electric models, it often means looking at the electric panel to see if there's enough room to power these new appliances. To help us navigate the trials and tribulations of the electric panel, I'd like to introduce Eric Morrill, who is a contractor, architect, and energy and sustainability specialist. Eric, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
Oops. There we go.
Hi, and I'm glad to be here. It's been great to see these projects. It's very, very inspiring. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about electrical panels, and more specifically, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what you can do on your existing electric panel if you feel like people have been telling you that you don't have enough space to add anything to it, because I think you probably do. And, you know, there are, in terms of the electrical panels that you have in your house, you might only have one panel. You might have one panel and then some sub panels that are feeding some of the loads that are connected to that main panel by a breaker that leads to the sub panel. If you've only got one panel, it's possible that, like this one in the middle here, it is directly adjacent to your meter. And like I said, for many people, your electrical service is not going to pose a problem in terms of adding some electrification loads right now. You can find out what your main breaker rating is, if you don't already, by looking close to your meter. There's going to be some sort of a disconnect for your entire unit or house. And a house that's got 100 amps can be electrified completely if it's, you know, sort of a medium or smaller house. Same for a unit. And above that, you can also manage to do it, but you have to do a little bit of magic and try to kind of finesse the loads and be careful about the machines that you're installing. And I should mention, this 100 amps, it's going to include a heat pump water heater, heat pump space heating, induction range, and a heat pump dryer, and level 2 EV charging. So you can put all that on as long as you are doing it correctly. So there is the possibility that you're going to have to do a service upgrade. And so I just wanted to talk about the difference between service upgrades and panel upgrades. If you've got less than 100 amps, and here we've got a main breaker that's a 40 amp breaker, then it's probably a good idea to have a long-term vision for how you're going to be working on the project in phases. Because like I said, maybe you've got an 80 amp breaker and you can put something on there, but you're thinking, by the end of this project, I'm going to need to upgrade the service. Now, if you've already got enough electrical service, 100 amps or maybe more, there are still some other problems that you can encounter at your panel. You might have no breaker spaces available. So here's a panel that has enough capacity electrically, but it just doesn't have any physical space to plug any new stuff into. Or you might have an older brand that's discontinued, and some of the older brands insurers don't like and they want you to replace. So that's one case where we recommend usually replacing the breaker, the actual panel. But if you are in sort of the second or third situation where you've got enough service, you can also, you know, a lot of older houses have no free breaker spaces. You can just add a little sub panel right next door. That's the most economically efficient way of doing it. If you want to replace the whole panel with a larger one, that's also possible, but it just takes more time to wire. So again, this is sort of the options for physical space limitations in your panel. If you need to add a new sub panel, like in this sort of a situation, I usually recommend that you don't add just the right size, especially if you're phasing your project and you only need 2 breaker spaces now. You should remember that each of these electrification moves that you're going to be making is going to require 2 full breaker spaces in the panel that you're putting in. And I also like to recommend, especially if you're thinking about a service upgrade later, that you put in a new panel that has at least 225 amps of electrical capacity in the bus bar, which is kind of like oversizing a downstream system. Doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but then maybe later you'll use that, and the cost is really only like $30 or $40 to get that larger electrical capacity in the bus bar. If you are upgrading on a smaller service, you might have a service that's 60 or 80 amps, especially if you're in an apartment. You might be able to electrify some things now. And the more you consider the loads that you're adding individually, the more space you'll leave yourself for the future. And EV charging is definitely one of the biggest loads, unless you're driving more than 200 miles a day on average. So like Monday 200, Tuesday 200, Wednesday 200. You don't need to have a super fast charger at home. It's kind of like wondering if you need to have a gas station at home. I think most people would conclude you don't, but you can install something that's a little bit smaller and leave space for other loads. And it's also good to note that if you've got a smaller service, you might want to prefer a condensing dryer or a single piece range, which takes less space in the National Electrical Code calculation methods that your contractor should be using as you add these loads to your building. Load sharing is also a neat trick that you can use if you are trying to avoid a service upgrade. So for example, you connect a range and a EV charger on the same circuit. So not only are you not having to accommodate for that extra load on your electrical service, so the amount of amperage you have, but you also share a spot in your panel, so you don't need as much physical breaker space. But this is something that is not allowed necessarily by all local jurisdictions and not for all loads. So there has to be a conversation with the building inspector before the project is kicked off. A couple of budget ways, just if you're listening and you're thinking, oh, this is, I'd love to start this project, but how do I start? There are a few really easy ways. We saw Jody and Silver are using one of these countertop electric induction cooktops. They're a low budget way, and you can just immediately tomorrow turn off your gas stove. You might not be uninstalling it, but you won't be using it anymore. And also, I like to point out that especially for larger houses, if you find that you're only in one room and your furnace is on, it's heating the whole house, heating blankets for staying warm are far more efficient than conditioning all of the air inside of your house. And both of these you can do without an electrician. So let's say you need a service upgrade. This entails filling out a PG&E application. PG&E charges about $2,000 for that minimum. And then you are responsible for hiring an electrical contractor to do your property's side of the work. And this can usually cost $6,000 or more dollars. That portion can get much more expensive if it's underground service or if your house is very far set back on the lot. And then it can also add a month to a year in delays, which is why I really like to recommend avoiding the service upgrade when you can. And like I mentioned, there are a couple of situations where that can take a really long time. It's partially because you might have to do underground work. PG&E might have their transformer that is at capacity, so that can take some time to resolve with PG&E. And then also the standards have gotten stricter in terms of the service that you put in. So your current service location might be too close to your gas, for example. And so you have to meet today's standards, and that can be difficult for some older buildings. It's all possible, but it just adds time and complexity. So thinking about next steps, just to finish up, when you're planning for full electrification, you want to find out your main disconnect amperage, which is your service that you have to the building. And then you should have a long-term plan. And that's something that it's also a service that we provide. I think there are a few people now who are doing that, and that's great. And then also, when you're adding these loads, make sure that they're part of that plan and that you don't put in an EV charger and suddenly realize you've exhausted all of your space for electrifying the other things. And I also like to mention that HVAC, and we saw this to some extent with some of the projects, your HVAC system can be smaller if you have done that insulation work So that's a great place to invest your money if you're looking to reduce those first costs for HVAC and also have ongoing energy benefits. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Eric. We're going to move on to our next house, but I just wanted to let everybody know that I used Eric's services to fully electrify my 1920s bungalow, and I am now all electric on a 100 amp panel. And so it can be done, and it's just a little bit of a Rubik's Cube. So it's good to know people like Eric to help you out.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Amy.
Okay, thank you.
For that excellent presentation and really taking something that can seem really complex and big and just boiling it down to a few basics. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and Eric's going to drop down into the Q&A if folks want to check in with him.